And away we go. Okay. Hi, Crystal. Thank you for joining my little intimate one on one poetry chit chat series for National Poetry Month. As you can tell, this does not have an official name, so it is what it is. But I'm so excited that you're here. We've known each other forever. We just had a 1 hour long conversation before this recording. So, yeah, thank you for doing this with me.
Thank you for having me, and maybe you should name this series Chit Chat or something.
Chit chat. I feel like chit chat is just the right amount of casual tete-a-tete that has like some modicum of, I don't know,
Yeah.
seriousness.
And
Like
there's like a poetic something about the ch and the ch
yeah, alliteration.
alliteration.
Yeah, that poetry is something.
I remember from my MFA, the
I know
one thing
poetic
really.
devices.
Yeah.
But thank you so much for coming. And for everybody watching, I'm gonna just like quickly read your bio. So everybody outside of our little circle can know how brilliant you are. So Crystal Yeung is a queer femme Asian American poet with an MFA in poetry from the College of New Rochelle. She holds a BA in English literature and was a part of the City College of New York Language and Literacy MA program. Her writing can be found in Rabbit Catastrophe Review, Poets and Writers, Perigee, Tayo, and Descant. She is recipient of Poets and Writers Emmy Award and Descant Betsy Colquitt Poetry Award. Serves as committee member for the Pen Peasant Writing Program and is poetry and reviews co-editor at Apogee Journal. Some hard words in your bio. Very.
Sorry, maybe I should have provided the IPA thing.
No, it indicates success. If the more unpronounceable things in your, portfolio, the more, like, look at the French. Who knows whether they're good at what they do?
They're adequate.
They're adequate, right? Yes,
Don't tell that to my ex.
as you would know. But okay, I'm gonna let you take it away. You're gonna be reading us a poem, and I'm gonna let you take it away.
Okay. And I will make this bigger. Okay. This poem is titled Astrophilia. Astronomy taught us our insignificance in nature. Ralph Waldo Emerson. I'm trying to be a better astronaut, to relive last year's clear-skied stratosphere, how your sawadee-ka shakes my temple like tectonic shift. Planetary change requires atmospheric break or astral alignment. This is not a soft suggestion, rather Newtonian or Superman to push harder against gravity, God, and light, to stop Earth's rotation, bookmark endless summers for lakes to twist and dry out into figure-8 aortas. But I'm no god, nor scientist, or extraterrestrial smart, but certainly terrestrial and trying. Your gravitational shift is an absence of policy. You have broken me without buying. Einstein would say, through theory of time, I was broken already, or how deserts were former oceans, how the pain reifies our exquisite existence, that we're revisiting ghosts of images moving too fast for our eyes. But I've read somewhere a way of repair to gild things in gold, things made more beautiful for having been broken and reborn through lacquer and fire. But you, all that black that courts the sun, could you tell me what air is without breathing? Could you tell me what gravity is without your feet touching the ground?
Thank you. That was fucking brilliant. And I love how what I love about your work is it starts with there is an exploration of something that we know so intimately, love and longing and desire and being wanted, and then but the weight of that and the expectation of that is always so imaginative and so large, and it's so universal. Like the universality is so wonderfully explored in this poem. The line that stood out to me, things made more beautiful for having been broken and reborn, every time I've heard this poem before, and when I hear it again, this line reminds me of your work, and and an attempt at what you're trying to do, that you're attempting to create beautiful poetry out of experiences that feel um, painful, or that feel personally, you know, in any way, the opinion of feeling experiences that have left you feel lesser than. And I'm thinking of how this idea of using, pain and desire and want, things that humble you, but using imagery that is so celestial and so awe-inspiring. So how do you arrive at a poem where both of those things can exist in the same narrative?
Um, I try to think of things, I mean, I guess maybe specifically for this poem in binaries or in polar opposites. Um, so I think I was using like elements from, that are terrestrial, that are earthbound, that are superhuman and, super innate to any kind of like sentient being that experiences grief or wanting or yearning, the things that you have said, and then try to push it out into the cosmos, of which those things are so insignificant and ant-like. So I work in that kind of vehicle. That was the kind of vehicle that drove this poem, in trying to like marrying the earthbound with the extraterrestrial, marrying like things that are broken and things that could be repaired. And so, along that same line of which you had mentioned, um, that is actually a type of like uh, Japanese art, of repairing broken ceramics with gold. I think it's called kintsugi. Um, and it's a type of art in where like things are intentionally broken and gold is melted into the cracks and crevices in order to be repaired. And it has even more value for having been broken.
Mm. I love that. I love also uh, the idea of using another existing form of, I would say, not necessary but abstract art, artistic practice, and to use that as sort of a, to to derive a compelling narrative for, one's own life. And then, I think about when I work with like poetry students, as you may have, and when you sit down with like beginner students, they always feel a little resistant to poetry, and they're always a little nervous about uh, the narrative weight of poetry, which, for many, they don't believe that prose has that narrative weight. Poetry, is expected, or they have the understanding that poetry is supposed to be a little complex, a little nuanced, a little, difficult to grasp, and it has to have these, vague uh, rhetorical questions that are being asked through it. And then there's also the imagery that a lot of them struggle with, struggle with like putting it in their own work. And sometimes the simple answer is look out of your window, right? If you're looking at imagery, look out of your window. But also, how do you take visuals and sensory details, and as a poet, how do you cull meaning out of those visuals and those, sentiments?
So the question is, how do I cull meaning from visuals? And
Yeah, like how would you suggest for young poets who struggle with that, how should they be approaching visuals in order to derive them into their own poetry?
I think as poets, I think you're given also a very rich history and arsenal of like poetic forms and poetic devices and just like techniques that you can utilize. I think my mentor for my MFA thesis had said, write about the things that you know, or write about the things that obsess you, that haunts you. Another professor had said, use forms like the ode or the pantoum or villanelle or sestina. I guess if sestina is too much for you, then try the tritina. And use the form as a sort of mold to pour in all of the chaotic thought. You can return to the same word as in like a guzzle for one. The same word will act as your sort of anchor, and that would have to be a very loaded word. Um, Thinking on like, I mean, just in that poem itself, thinking on binaries. What are things that are just so irrevocably married to each other?
Mm.
I mean, what is married to each other than just like grief and celebration? And I think that, you know, as writers and as poets, and actually it was something that my own student had spoken about, was she had said that a lot of her writing was just like super sad and super depressing. And, you know, I had offered that we do need to take some time to like kind of like buck that stereotype of writers and being super like self-indulgent or like self-flagellating in terms of our sorrows, however legitimate they may be. I think we could take a breath to celebrate, to um, celebrate our histories, celebrate our survival, and celebrate our scars.
Mm. I love that. And I love, especially with self-flagellating, or for a lot of times, young poets, when they're introduced to poetry, they look at the poetic form as something that has to be witness to every single shameful, secret and pain, and, just pours out. But pretty soon, that intensity to share through poetry, while that can nurture and encourage a lot of interesting work, but that intensity can also sometimes breed a very run-of-the-mill journalistic voice, like Dear Diary kind of a voice in your poetry, where in fact you are trying to expunge like a beauty or a image or a meaning out of an experience, right? An experience is just not a poem of an experience is, cannot just exist because of, and there has to be more to it. um and I love that, and I think about the pain of, the writers that I've loved who have created poetry, like, I was talking to Devin about Dennis Johnson, and just thinking about Dennis Johnson had a very interesting life, and his prose is very reflective in of how chaotic his whole experience is, but his poetry is again so beautiful, and it's sad, but there's also reflection, and there's also pause, and there's also witnessing. And I wanted to think about it, like, what are some of the poets that you have loved and read who you think are able to balance that, who are able to write about their or a life, because I do not suggest poetry is autobiographical as everybody thinks it is. You would agree, but who can write about life, in a very naked way, but also pair it up with, meaning.
Um, so I guess like it maybe in a way like model poets that model or that
Mhm.
I also kind of model after. I think one of them has got to be, and someone that I do return to often is Salma Sharif
Mm.
in her collection Look. I think it's just brilliant in terms of the way that it is just um, the heart and soul of it is just really like hyper focused on language
Mm. Yeah.
and how it could reward and also be super violent because I think the sort of thing that she was doing with the book with her any of the poems in Look was using terminologies from a some sort of dictionary of military terms, and so those words are capitalized um, in all of the poems. So they could be words like look in itself, LLOK, is like, I believe it's like some sort of base, as in like a lookout or something for intelligence gathering. There could be words like explosion, words that that they're basically military terms. I think like just in the form of itself, the sort of conceit of the work is just based on, I mean, also her herself being, I think, Iranian American, and just like writing from that place of intersecting war and grief and trying to find peace within it all through something like a dictionary and just concentrating on its loaded meanings, and trying to find reprieve in it all, I think is, yeah.
Yeah, so much sure it was exceptional. I wish I could tell you. I was thinking about this poem that I'd read of Sharif a couple of days ago. I just can't seem to remember, but I will. This is my moment where I'm just like, oh, I have to return to that poem. But thank you so much. Is there anything else you'd like to tell me or tell anybody who's watching this about the craft of writing poetry? What has been the most important lesson to you in writing poetry that you perhaps learned through the act of writing it or through someone? You said like that your mentor said, write what you know. But what else have you learned through your own experiences of writing poetry?
That's a loaded question. What did I learn? One
of, I don't know, one of the things I realized is that because of the excessive amount of learning and reading that we've done, not necessarily as writers, but also as participants in the education system, our mind is just trained to go, or at least mine is sometimes, to go to the obvious. And that I have to physically, it's like the very act of opening up a third eye. I have to like physically force myself to think of other ways and other perspectives and place myself in bodies and lenses that can distinguish what I'm seeing. And poetry, because the obviousness doesn't help anyone in the act of writing or reading. And so that's one of the things I have to like, sometimes it comes to me very easily, and sometimes I have a poem in mind that I'm working on, but it's just the eye is so blasé and it's so sometimes cliched. I don't know. Do you feel that way?
Yeah, I think I think like maybe if you're an emerging writer or like a really really young writer, like maybe starting out in high school, I think what was helpful, just especially like if you're in the educational machine where you're just churning out numbers more than quality, right? A lot of it is just based on imitation and emulation, right? So I mean, I kind of still follow that to some extent. I think I try to pick the things that fascinates me, even in the moment. Just kind of shop around for topics, shop around for headlines that are like super grabbing, that are maybe either topical, but then sometimes it could be topical, or sometimes it could be really mundane. If we can write about, or imagine the possibilities of what, and this is something that I've taught my workshop in, a photograph, and what does this photograph mean? I've written about a picture of my mother in a sailor's uniform, standing next to a woman, overlooking like a lake. And I just imagine the possibilities of like, what were they doing there? And what does, a bunch of people living in a Chinese village in the early 80s mean?
Politically and historically and culturally, right?
And possibilities. And just like running with conjectures. I think like maybe it's okay to run on just theory, you know, running on yeah.
I love that. I love that. The idea of like, because that again comes back to what we were talking about, right? The poetry, so many people think that poetry is autobiographical, or that because there is an emphasis on my and you and our and I,
Mm.
that there is a sense of like, there is a sense of reality about it. And so many times I want to say, no, there isn't. This didn't happen. Like I put a poem out and this didn't happen, which is not an argument you can make for nonfiction or creative nonfiction. But with poetry, it's hard because like, you want to say this didn't happen and this didn't happen, but also you don't want to say it because you want that again, that conjecture to run beyond the page and into
Yeah.
the possibility to exist even after a poem has been read.
Yeah. Which is another thing, like when I'm with my students, I'm like, you know, they say they don't get it. But then I also like, I mean, for the sake of the program, I chose pieces that dealt really explicitly with like identity and race and with, you know, homes that are like multilingual or like cultural. And while they don't necessarily understand it, or they, you know, maybe like certain poetic techniques or metaphors, um, and just language usage might be elusive to them, they might get the overall message. And I ask them to also trust in the poet and knowing what they're doing
Mm.
and letting the poem, you know, I think we are also getting caught up in like self-editing along the while, but just like trusting the poem will lead you where it needs to go.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. I love. Yeah, yeah. I love that. I don't know how it happens to you, but sometimes when I'm writing a poem and I don't know how the poem's gonna end, I just know what started it and what stirred it, but I know exactly when I'm done. And then
Mhm,
of course you have to edit it, and that may not be the last line, in the
mhm.
reimagination process and the revision process. However the poem exists in the final draft, that may not be the last line, but in that moment it is, and in that moment you feel like you've said everything you had to say.
Yeah,
It feels like, you're holding in a breath and then you release it.
yeah. I mean, I could definitely count how many poems where I know like I'm opening with this and I know I'm ending with this, but this middle portion is just
Who
I'm
knows?
put it somewhere on my to-do list.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. But thank you so much for speaking to me. I am going to stop the recording and continue speaking to you after. So if other people want to
Bye.
hear more about this, then they have to be friends with us, I guess.
Yeah.
Bye.